Just to keep in with the theme of today, we called this modelling for cost reduction. I just wanted to state that all the work we did with the pharmaceutical industry was not to reduce costs, it was to increase profits. So it was nice that they weren't always just looking at reducing costs. Okay, what I'm going to do today is talk about, very briefly, to mention a few application areas that we've worked in over the last 5 or 6 years, and then concentrate on one specific example. And then I've got a few slides which were created by the client as part of the workshops that we used to go through to help, first of all, develop the model, but then also to train other people, other senior directors and managers within the organisation as to how to use the model, what the model's doing it for them, and how to interpret the results. I have to acknowledge my colleague in this. He was one of the senior directors of this pharmaceutical company, Matteo Novick. He's since started his own consultancy in Switzerland. It would have been nice if he could have come today and given you his own brand of a presentation, which is quite dramatic. So, example applications that we've been involved in, I can't see, okay. Example applications that we've been involved in include what I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail on product lifecycle management. Product lifecycle management means a very specific thing within the pharmaceutical industry. But we've also, with this particular client and with other clients, looked at using lean optimization techniques using system dynamics for waste reduction and obviously cost reduction in on that side. With individual drug products, we've looked at resource allocation, resource requirements, and helped them reduce cycle times and costs through the supply chain. Supply chain redesign is something that is not really necessarily a cost reduction approach, but the example I can give you is we were looking at, for example, an organisation that had its major processes distributed over a number of cities in Switzerland and in Germany, and they wanted to bring them all together on one super site. And we used system dynamics to help them understand what the likely implications might be and to help drive a much bigger project. Obviously, it's a bigger project than a simple simulation model. Campaign size optimization is just a very simple example again of a campaign in the pharmaceutical industry is a series of batches of product being produced before you change to a different product, and in between the products you have to clean the machines and what have you. So there's an optimal solution for the campaign size, and there's obvious feedback in the responses from the customers, and the customers in this case are internal customers, but they are treated as external customers. So they're part of the pharmaceutical supply chain within the organisation, but they are separate business units and they are quite demanding of the manufacturing side. The specific example, product lifecycle management, some of the slides I have here were presented at a product lifecycle management symposium a few months ago in London, and were created by Matteo Novick. And his style of, well, you'll see, his style of slides is somewhat old-fashioned. Okay, so when we put in what we're doing into context, we have drug discovery, product lifecycle management, manufacturing network, and what they call in the organisation strategic product portfolio and supply chain management. Now, we have a number of models we were working on the supply chain side, but this particular model is looking at the drug development side, where there are specific objectives to be achieved for each drug product, potential drug product, as it goes through the various phases of development. And at each of those phases in development, there are various risk assessments that have to be done. There are quality control issues, there are compliance issues, there are all sorts of issues that have to be addressed. So, in the value generation stream, we've got a few elements on the screen there, and this is one of Matte's wonderful dynamic presentations. We go from clinical, preclinical phase, which we're not representing in the model at all. We're just looking at the drug development side of things, and we're not looking at the commercial marketed product, which is where the profits come into play. And of course, those profits. So we have the product lifecycle phases, objectives, and processes that we are modelling. The end result is hopefully a successful drug product. We're not looking at the complexities of drug copies and all the different problems that the pharmaceutical industry has on that score. But we were just simply looking at an analysis of the investment of the profits that are coming in now into the development of drugs for future profits and growth of the organisation. Oh, and just in case you didn't know, that's called a system. I said this was one of his internal presentations of some of these slides. So it's complex, dynamic, networked, sensitive in both the long and short term, and applicable to any product lifecycle management problem within this particular industry. You'll see when I show you bits of the model that it's very similar to any sort of project management model. There are just various peculiarities for the pharmaceutical industry. And again, this is one of Matteo's slides. He uses these to show fellow directors what he's trying to do with his team in business process excellence. So we're maximising business benefit through optimisation of the performance of the product portfolio life cycle as a whole. It's not a natural English speaker, by the way, so I've had to change some of the sentences. They're quite long. Enable proactive product portfolio life cycle management and strategic governance. And under each of these two headings, there are a number of elements which explain what we're trying to do with the model. Now, I thought we'd go through that just to put into context, and then we can have a look at some more of the detail and some of the output and some of the lessons learned, if you want to call it that. So we're enhancing time to market, which is basically the pipeline, or accelerating the pipeline of drug product development to enhance the value generation, while balancing the resources within the organisation. Manpower, person power, I should say, is obviously one of the most expensive resources within the pharmaceutical industry. But they also have very expensive capital plant, machinery, equipment and what have you, and a very large number of potential drug products which are going through that cycle or through that process. They have to also, this is the not quite right, we're maintaining quality and compliance, we're not maintaining risk, we're trying to minimise risk. Okay. While incorporating priorities, policies and metrics. And this is the feedback that, or the input that we would be putting into the simulation to allow the senior managers to see the implication of different policies on the profitability of the business. And I have to go and talk about another model very briefly. When we say competencies and capabilities, the first model we built with this particular customer was a very strange one, because it was so high level. It was talking about the capabilities of the organisation at a very sort of abstract level. And we went through a huge number of workshops with various people within the organisation and came up with a capability map, let's say, what influences what in terms of, what influences our ability to do project management or quality control or whatever it might be. And so we've included the output from that work as part of this particular model. And we also look at the different technologies that they use, very easily classified into the simple everyday technology they use and they have been using forever, to very complex technologies that are just coming on the market and they're trying to work out how to use them. And so they have little experience of those technologies, and so training is required, etc., etc. If it looks like I'm going to finish in about 3 hours, just tell me to speed up. Okay, really? Oh dear. Okay, so, and on the, I'll just quickly go through this one. So why are we using a model-based approach, which is something that was very new to the organisation? They had, and if anybody works in the pharmaceutical industry here, the pharmaceutical industry uses simulation models quite a lot, and business process management models, very different to system dynamics models that we're used to. But this is the sort of considered opinion of the directors I was working with as to what they were trying to do with this approach. Okay, so that's part of the model. I'm not expecting you to read it. There will be, you will be able to download this or whatever, so you can look at it. So this is part of the model, one of the modules which is looking at the drug product development itself. Okay, so we have the objective stock of work that needs to be done. You've seen these sort of things before. Progress that's going on that work, and this is the perception of completion of that objective. And then we have rework and undiscovered rework, and all those sort of things you expect to see in a project management type model. We've got, as I said, undiscovered rework, discovered rework, actual objective completion, what have you. I've got a slide that I can show if I have time at the end, but one of the peculiar things with this particular organisation is they didn't want the model to be split into modules. They wanted to see the whole thing on one great big sheet, which is very unusual because normally you would break it down into its components. But it seemed to work with, well, they have these fantastically massive printers, so they could create these great big posters. And in the workshops that we had massive posters on the wall, and we would stand at the poster and discuss things rather than round a computer, which seemed to work very, very well. And it was their idea, because I like breaking things up into small bits. Okay. When we're introducing the model to people who haven't been part of the model development team, we use very high-level diagrams instead of the actual model itself. And using Vensim's multiple high-level capability, we can then build up a story of the structure of the model and have some textual explanations at each stage. The whole thing is wrapped up in an interface, so they can take the interface away and investigate the model and look at the diagrams and as a user manual and all the sort of things you expect to see with an application. That's that full model, but at an overview stage. So at the top we have the individual objectives following a path. We have resource requirements, resource allocation, training. We do have a representation of the current knowledge and experience of the technologies and methodologies that they're using for a particular drug product. And those technologies and methodologies will be related to the type of active pharmaceutical ingredient that they're using. But it's nothing that the model is trying to work out. This is just input. So if we say this particular drug product has these characteristics, then these are the technology levels that have to be used at each objective stage. The other modules give you some flavour of what else is included in the model. Your standard things such as motivation and quality. Cycle times, value generation, key performance indicators, they're all outputs from the model. They were all devised. They were partly a series of KPIs that they already had, but some that we developed during the workshops with them. Some statistics on the model. The example I'm going to show only has 10 drug products in the model. There are 40 objectives that have to be achieved. They are sequential, but one objective can start at risk before the previous objectives completed. 6 types of equipment, 8 types of personnel, 6 technology types, 3 methodologies, etc., etc., etc. Simulation runs for 10 years and takes about 2-3 seconds on my computer to run. So we can do it. I think you might have realised possibly that there's a stochastic element to this because we are looking at probability of failure at each point at the end of each objective, and so we have to run the simulation, thousands of times to get a decent analysis. This was a user interface that was created in the learning mode, let's say, to distribute or disseminate, should I say, the work that we had done. It's not the interface we use as analysts to run the model and investigate the model. So it looks at the key performance indicators. One thing we've also learned is most managers don't like to have an interface that involves clicking through several layers trying to find things that they need to find. And so we have a very flat structure where the inputs and outputs are all at the same level, and we just use tabs to move between them. You can't avoid it sometimes, you have to go into deeper levels, but trying to avoid as many levels as possible. And as it says, for illustration purposes only. This is one of Matteo's presentations. He says this is how we use the cockpit. We have a reason for using the application itself. Well, we want to try and improve the pipeline progress, so look at the resource requirements, so the market has changed and we have different investment opportunities. The first thing that Matteo would say to them is we would look at the causal relationships between what we want to look at, for example, progress on objectives, what the inputs are, what the outputs are, and start doing a proper causal analysis without actually running the simulation model first, so they get a feel, in conjunction with the high-level diagrams, for what the model is all about. There are actions, in this case drivers are not actions, but they will have slider bars or some sort of inputs that they can change. We simulate, and then we look at the impact on the key performance indicators, which gives us some sort of focus on a solution or a way forward. Some example output. We have 3 simulation runs here. We always have a baseline run, which I think is red. Yeah. So we have a baseline run, and we have, if I just go quickly back up, there's something on here called resource multiplier. Now, in this case, what this means is when a drug product is going through a particular objective, it needs X number of a certain resource. Now, when that objective, if that objective falls behind schedule, they are able to allocate additional resources up to a maximum. You can't have 300 lab technicians working on one particular objective, for example. And so that's just a simple slider bar to show what the impact would be if you don't allocate anything above the normal number of technicians, or if you allocate up to the maximum number of technicians. So it's an overall policy thing, just to see what effect it might have. And so those simulation runs have been done just to show what impact that might have on the value generation. And so the green is a situation where they were unable to respond to falling behind schedule, and the yellow was they were able to apply additional resources. And of course, the organisation over a 10-year period might need to recruit and train and might be losing people as well. So there's all sorts of implications for bringing more resources in. And so and again, these are reasonable values that were put into the model, but they're not the actual values for this particular company. And so you could see, or they could immediately see, that the benefit to them in value generation was an extra 20% over that, well, actually 5 billion euros over that 10-year period. When we worked with the clients, we used things like the user interfaces, and we designed the interfaces specifically for each individual task. It wouldn't be one interface for the application, wrap it up, give it to the client, bye-bye, thank you very much. There was always a reason for that interface, whether it be workshops that we were running internally, whether we were running Vensim training courses, for example, but using their own model. So we had to design them specifically for what they wanted. I mentioned earlier about posters. That was the client's idea. I think they used that on the business process modelling software that they were using prior. And just to give you an idea, that's an example of one of the posters, indeed. Imagine it's on that sort of scale, but you can read it. So there would be, I'll tell you what's in the top left, we have vision, mission, purpose, scope, objectives of the project that we're working on. There's a few elements of the model there, some of the outputs, some of the causal trees. That would be in the background. This is not part of model development. This would be when we're trying to bring people into the team, so to speak. This is an example of a poster that was created, version 60 of the model, where the elements that we had discussed in the last workshop were reworked and put onto this poster as a means of starting the next stage of discussing the model. Obviously, we would be using the computer as well, but they seem to like this and draw on the actual posters themselves. Some of the posters had definitions of what we mean by things like technology and methodology, and so instead of them seeing something called standard or complex or new, we would define exactly what that means to them. Not available in the network, its complexity arises from our lack of exposure with the technology, etc., etc. So they'd know what that means. And the storyboard is, I mean, we've all used this sort of approach where we would take the high-level diagram and start building up the structure bit by bit, so that anybody new to the model could understand what's included and, quite importantly, what's not included in what we're modelling. So just goes to show, we go from a small bit, there's our small bit again, we built up a bit more, then we build up a little bit more, bit more, until we have the whole of the model exposed. And it carries on. So, am I on time? Too early? Spot on. Right, questions. I've got a few more slides, hopefully, to show as well, but if there are any questions, I'll do my best to answer them at this stage.
How long did it take?
What, to develop this model?
Yeah, all of
it. It was a very piecemeal development. So in man days, it's hard to. It was over a 6-month period, but I would probably say it was about 40, 50 man days of my time. But the client was an educated, knowledgeable Vensim user himself, so he did a lot of work himself and his team. And that was one of the drawbacks of technology transfer or knowledge transfer in this case, is that they don't need us anymore. So we've gone on to other things. So we don't do too much in pharmaceuticals at the moment, but yeah, about 6 months.
How did the senior managers react to the storyboards? Because they are, quite impressive visual displays.
They liked those complex posters more than they liked storyboards.
Right, yeah.
It was when we were trying to explain it in a workshop where we're training people on the system dynamics concepts that the storyboards worked well.
Okay.
Certainly within one session, everybody was au fait with the terminology and the way that you use, the arrows and the stops and the flows and all those sort of things. But as far as the storyboard is always something we always do now as a company when we're presenting the results at any stage in the model development. So we give the client the model, obviously, but also the means to understand the model if we're not there.
What more did you get for which less?
Oh, good question.
What did the company get? What did they get?
They would be able to make better use of the resources that they had by balancing the resources in a more proactive way rather than reacting. They were very reactive in the way they organised the chain. In fact, when we were developing this model, even the senior directors weren't entirely sure how the system worked. Obviously, we know that. We see that all the time. And, it was an eye-opener for them, even standing in front of the initial poster that we created, which was way off from the final poster. But that was an eye-opener for them. And then they immediately started engaging with it to develop it into into something that worked for them. But they're getting more out of what they had. I don't think they were trying to invest in additional machinery or additional resources. I think, given that this was 2008, I think they were trying to get as much as they could out of what they've got, rather than invest.
Did that present a challenge to you, that your client was already very familiar with modelling?
Yeah.
And so you ended up building a very detailed model that was hard to land with the senior stakeholders?
It's always a problem. It's a problem if the client has no idea, and it's a problem if they have lots of experience in, say, discrete event simulation, or and this particular person came from, he didn't come from a simulation background, but he was an engineer, worked in the paper industry first, and then into pharmaceuticals. And he'd had 30 years in pharmaceuticals and knew the whole thing. I mean, he was renowned in the organisation as being the guy to go to because he knew everything. And so it was difficult to question what we were doing. And I was always given partly made models by him to fix, and then sort of take that forward and be you have to be quite diplomatic in the way that you then reflect back to them that something that you've created is what they've started, but it looks quite different because it now works and it didn't before.
Could you just describe a little bit about the process by which the model was used within the organisation?
Well, the simplified models are basically just pictures. They were the high-level views of the more complicated model. But this model was never used by senior directors. It was always in the hands of the analysts within what was called at the time business process excellence, I think. And so it would be directed by someone upon high, but they wouldn't get involved in running the model. Yes, in fact, they do have very sophisticated programming tools for planning the pipeline of products. But what they don't have in those tools is any of the feedback that comes from things going wrong, things going right, lessons learned, requirements for additional resources, the training, the morale, the knowledge, all those sort of aspects. And it was more...
Very good. Lovely. Thank you very much, Lee.
Thank you.